Ooh, that is majestic. Welcome to week 18, end of week 18. Another glorious day. It's not been a brilliant week, but the weather today has been absolutely fantastic. And well, you can see this is what's going on. It's been a busy week. The simplicity of last week, after getting over the first hurdles of putting the rafters onto the roof, we then, if you watch the video, you'll see we rigged up an A-frame and hoisted the rafters relatively simply onto the purlin up there. And this week, of course, somewhat foolishly, I thought we could just do the same thing. And forgetting the fundamental issue that actually the ground on this side of the site slopes dramatically upwards. We also have this slightly awkward, enormous pile of earth, which prevented us from getting our 10-metre rafters in the right position and prevented us from hoisting them easily on top of the purlin. So the second day, I think, of this week, it was actually really difficult. We kind of came to a standstill. Lots of people straining themselves and trying to push really hard. And actually the advantage of the A-frame just wasn't working. So I had to kind of reset, rethink. And in the end, we solved it using an idea that I'd had right at the beginning of this project, which was to use a rafter as a ramp. So we managed to take one of the rafters that we'd previously placed on the purlin, just like this one here, and we angled the new rafters to go up with the thin ends facing down slope, attached hoist ropes which went up and over the purlin to pulling teams right over on the other side, and then we physically hauled the rafter up the ramp and onto the wall plate. It was raining that day and it worked like a dream. It worked really well. In fact, it was easy to pull it too fast and to sort of get it in the wrong position. So we did that, and that's been our method since. This side of the building over here, the ground slopes away and it's not so much of an issue, but it will become an issue soon. So effectively, as you can see here, we've set up our rafter as a ramp in that position, and we've used the same methodology. And it's worked really well, pretty efficiently. It's really interesting to note, though, that today it's been much drier, and the hauling team found it a lot harder to pull that rafter up a dry timber, as you would expect, than they found on a wet timber. Let's just have a look at this side. Look at that. What an amazing view. You'll notice, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that our ridge starts to sweep up, and this is really an unavoidable part of the shape of the building. The walls actually taper. They're wide there and they taper closer to these main posts the further forward you come. And that inevitably means that our angle, our pitch of our rafters increases, it steepens as we come this way on the building. I'm just going to get a closer view for you. And right at the beginning of this process, when I was designing this building all those years ago, I was very aware that we could potentially have a slightly strange looking rising ridge on the building. And you can see, if I just get a shot through here, you'll see that the rafter angle at the back is less than it is at the front, and here it becomes really quite steep. I mean, ignore the length of the rafters, they're too long, but even so, where they intersect at the top is gradually rising upslope. It's interesting again, and we've had a chat about this today, because having grown up and designed buildings in Western Europe, surrounded by the buildings that we're familiar with, we are used to horizontal ridges in buildings. You know, the house I live in has a horizontal ridge. I'm assuming that everyone that volunteers on this project has a house with a horizontal ridge. And it raises, once again, a fundamental question, which is, why do we have houses with horizontal ridges? And does it actually matter if the ridge on a building rises and is not a uniform horizontal angle? You could argue it in any number of ways. I mean, I go back to the beginning on this because, as I've said, I think many times on these videos, we still don't know whether this was a building or whether it was something else. And as I've said from the start, it will work as a building. You can turn this ground evidence and the sort of circumstantial Neolithic carpentry evidence into a building that works, but that doesn't mean this was a building. But let's just assume it was a building, and you weren't constrained by our notions of horizontal ridges. By the time that ridge comes forwards with two more rafters, it'll actually be raising quite dramatically up there somewhere. And actually, what an incredible impression that will make. If you imagine that this was a building in the Neolithic and you were approaching it to use it for whatever this building was used for, your first impression through the doorway, I'm just going to stand on the centre line here, would be of this amazingly high point on the roof. Could be really dramatic architecturally. And again, today it kind of reminded me of some of those architectural tricks, really, that have been used throughout history. And the one that comes to mind is the sort of forced perspective that you get on classical Grecian colonnades, and the fact that they're not parallel, but they actually taper and they swell to force the eye to think that they're taller than they actually are. Now, I wouldn't be so bold as to suggest that that's what this building was doing, because as I say, we don't really know that it was a building. I think it was a building, but we don't know that. But nevertheless, it puts in mind that sort of notion of using architecture to make something more dramatic than it would otherwise be. Anyway, there it is. You'll notice as well that there are lots of hazel panels have been constructed this week, and just want to show you a few because they're really beautifully made actually. So we've got a sort of traditional round hazel panel here where the woven hazel rods are sort of moulded around or pressed around these vertical zales. And we've had an issue in that some of our wall gaps are incredibly narrow. And from the beginning, we've been sort of working out how we might fill those gaps using our woven hazel. And interestingly, this week, Graham had a go at doing something a bit different. I'm going to run you through the process and what he tried. So if we look at a normal hazel panel, here we are, 3 zales, woven round hazel in between. And what Graham tried on this particularly narrow gap here was to effectively put in the zales horizontally and to weave longitudinally, vertically, the split hazel in between. And it creates a really good, it's a pretty solid panel. I can press on that and it doesn't move, just like the others. And it's interesting, somebody this week rightly said, how will the daub stick on that? And it's a really good question, because it's sort of tempting to think that because these are vertical, the daub might slip and slump. We'll only know when we come to try that. But while that was going on, Ros was experimenting with a different method, which I have to say I never would have thought of. It's interesting, there are a few of us on site who have done a fair bit of work with hazel over the years, done lots of hurdle making, lots of continuous woven fencing, and all of us have agreed over the last few days that we never would have thought of doing it in this way. And this comes from a photograph of a medieval hazel panel in a shop in Salisbury, which is the closest town to us, closest city to us. And in that shop is an exposed piece of medieval wattle, and it shows it in a very narrow gap, and it shows 2 zales, one either side. And what's fascinating is that the woven hazel sticks in between, actually cross each other and lock each other in. So there's no need for a central sail. It's a really fascinating thing. This is a really good example of it here. You can see it wrapping around and tucking in behind the sail. And honestly, I mean, this is why I love projects like this, because I never would have thought of that method. And this is the joy of working with volunteers again, is that they go away, they get their teeth into something, they find something and they have a go. I'm just going to show you another particularly fine example over here. This is on the inside, but you can see how it's been constructed really well. So just to sort of clarify this myriad of split hazel sticks, one is placed across between the sails and the other one is tucked behind and brought forward and locked off behind a sail. But look at that. What an absolutely beautiful thing. And importantly, absolutely solid. Passes the push test really well. Just move to the front of the building because it's been one of those amazing weeks actually. So much going on. Obviously rafters going up and being temporarily lashed into place, but even these panels on the frontage here have been woven. Again, that was done by actually in that case some really skillful volunteers who have done this before, really knowledgeable. David and Sue, and here Graham had a go at this tall one here, and again the learning curve is steep, but he's made a fantastic job of that. Really solid, really nicely done. So the building moves on. You're probably wondering, as we all are, about the rafters, because this is week 18, so I think we started the rafters in week 1, end of week 1. That was our induction week where we were training and learning lots of skills and how to be safe. So let's say 17 weeks. For 17 weeks, these volunteers have been working, axing, hewing, and today we reached an incredible milestone. And that is that we have finished hewing our principal rafters, and you'll notice immediately, look at all the grass, look how many have gone onto the roof, and this is what's left, and these are complete. These are ready to be put up on the roof next week, maybe the week after, and then we start the long process, yet another long process of taking hazel battens and lashing them to those rafters. Effectively, the way the building works structurally is that these rafters will bear hazel that's lashed horizontally onto them to form essentially a ladder that runs up the roof. And that ladder will be used by us. We will be climbing on that ladder. We'll use some safety harnesses and make sure that we can't fall and hit the ground. But we'll be climbing that ladder and we'll be using it to access the pegs on the purlins and to lash and joint probably some of those joining rafters at the very top. So that's the next stage. We're gonna leave behind endless amounts of axing, and we're going to start to get very sore fingers by endless amounts of lashing and pulling strings really tight. But what a week. I'm going to stop talking and just let you admire some of this beautiful timber.